Okay, hello everyone in person and on Zoom joining us today. My name is Sigal Ben-Porat. I'm the faculty director for the SNF Paideia Program, which is our program here on campus that is committed to cultivating dialogue at Penn. And through fellowships for undergraduate and graduate students, through supporting instructors who teach courses in all different schools and majors, we are supporting students who want to learn about dialogue, to learn through dialogue, and to learn to dialogue across their various differences. And of course, we also do that through hosting events like this one, which are meant to enable dialogue. And we are very grateful to have as part of our work the support of the Gamba Family Foundation for the Red and Blue Exchange, a program that focuses on dialogue across ideological differences. And this event is part of that effort and is part of our election series. We've had various events leading up to the election, and we have 2 events planned for after the election on November 8th and November 14th. So well, check out our Instagram. So there's going to be various opportunities to engage after we have the results of the election, or as we make our way towards having the results of the election. Before I turn to our moderator and the event, given that this is a dialogue space, I just want to give people both here in person and on Zoom the opportunity to think for a moment to themselves, what are some questions that bring you in? What is something that you would like to hear, or you would like to make sure that you voice, or that you ask, or that you learn during the event today? If somebody is sitting next to you, you can turn to them and workshop your question so that you can feel prepared to ask it during the Q&A. If you are sitting solo or on Zoom, you can just jot a note for yourself in preparation for the Q&A. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment. Please see if you want to turn to somebody next to you and think about what motivates you to be here and what you'd like to ask. In whispering, I hope you're preparing some questions to ask of our excellent panel. So let me introduce our moderator, who will then introduce the rest of the panelists. So this right here to my left is Brian Rosenwald, who teaches here at Penn, is also the editor-in-chief of Made by History in the Washington Post history section, and is the author of the great book that I recommend to you, Talk Radio's America, How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. Brian, we're very lucky to have him as the director of the Red and Blue Exchange within the SNF Paideia Program, and he will be moderating the panel from here on. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Sigal. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, just to let people in the room know, we will have note cards that go around in a little while. And then you can put your questions on those, and then we'll pick them up, and I'll ask questions for about 45 minutes. And then we will take the audience questions and try to get to as many of them as we can. But we're thrilled to have a really distinguished panel with us today. So we've got Eugene Daniels, who is one of the co-authors of Playbook, which is sort of the Bible, I think, for most people in politics. They wake up every morning and read it. And he's a staff writer at Politico, and he's covered just about everything. And he's a senior MSNBC political analyst. So he's on television as well. David Drucker is a writer, senior writer for the Dispatch. He breaks an awful lot of news, and just did a tour of Pennsylvania. And so he's been all over the state and sees things. He's also the author of a great book, Trump's Shadow: The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. Sarah McCammon is a national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She's also the author of an amazing book called The Evangelicals that will tell you more about a huge political force in our politics, in evangelical Christians, and really provides all kinds of interesting insight on that topic. I highly recommend it. It's called The Evangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. And we got Greg Sargent here, who is a staff writer at The New Republic and host of the podcast, The Daily Blast. And he was at the Washington Post for a long time. And he also breaks all kinds of interesting news, especially policy stuff that you get that other people do not get. So we're thrilled to have this panel with us. And we're going to talk about all things the election. But I think I might as well start with the big elephant in the room, which is, where do each of you think this race stands 2.5 weeks before Election Day? Anybody can go in any order.
All right, well, is this thing on? Okay, so yeah, I don't know why you guys are here. Here's the interesting thing about this race is I do believe the data is correct and that it is very close, and I think either candidate could win, which tells you absolutely nothing. Insightful. But I'll use, as Brian alluded to my trip last week, a colleague of mine and I, Mike Warren, great reporter, we flew to Pittsburgh. We went Pittsburgh, Erie, down through Du Bois in Clearfield County, to Cambria County and Johnstown, then up to Reading. We covered a Trump rally, spent the night, went up to Northampton, Allentown, East End, came down to Philly, and did a little work in the suburbs. And what I found were a lot of indicators that conflict if you're going to say, well, one side is winning and one side is losing. Right. The Republicans are just convinced that Trump is going to win, that people don't like the vice president as much as some people think, and that it's going to break for Trump. And that's actually possible, that things break late for Trump if people decide, or at least that sliver of persuadables, undecideds, if they conclude that Biden just has not been a good enough president and we don't want any continuation of his administration. And by the way, when Trump was president, I've memory hold the pandemic, which a lot of voters have done, and we didn't have inflation back then, and the world seemed stable. Like, he may have been unstable, but the world was stable. And I, in fact, ran into a Republican voter knocking on doors with Democrats last week, and it was a neighborhood where there were a lot of Democratic voters, but there was one lifelong Republican who said to me, you know, I don't like anything he says or tweets. It's awful. But when he was president, he just kind of did normal Republican things. And I'm a Republican, and he did normal Republican things, so I'm for him. By the same token, I was out with Democrats, going door to door, looking at their field offices, talking to them about what they're seeing. And they told me that they have not seen enthusiasm and a response from the grassroots for a presidential candidate since Barack Obama, essentially. In Erie County, Sam Tallarico is the Democratic chairman. I had him tell me, again, it's all like anecdotal, right? It's not necessarily data. But he told me, you know, we always do these debate watch parties every 4 years, the presidential debate. And yeah, we usually get 20, 30 people. It's like, I had 325 people. I didn't know where to put them. We went to his field office, the county party, downtown Erie. It was, you know, it's kind of busy. He's like, oh no, the Harris field office is a few blocks away. You should go see them. So I go to a second field office, and this place is bustling with people, right? How many doors they've knocked on. There are people from in-state, from out of state, came there to help because they live in blue states. And so you look at a tie race with a much better ground game. It just is. It doesn't mean she'll win, but it's just better. And it's like, and you hear these reports about the enthusiasm, the interest, and you're like, oh, like this is what a winning campaign looks like. And I was at the Trump rally in Reading, and he didn't quite fill it up, but it was still like a lot of people. And they have their iPhones out like they're at a concert, and they're just standing up, recording him like he's a rock star. And it's like, yeah, they're still enthusiastic about him. Now, granted, these are Trump supporters to the core, but it's not like nobody's showing up. So when I say I have conflicting pieces of information, at least from my reporting, and I can't seem to get a handle on how this is going to go, that's what I mean by that. And so
that could all change tomorrow, or it could be in the middle of changing because we'll get the data from whatever poll a few days from now. But that's what I see so far.
I feel similarly. Wait, turn it on. Hello. I feel similarly conflicted when it comes to what I'm seeing and hearing. And I think, I think back to 2016 at this point in the race, everybody I knew privately was reaching out and saying, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And that's what happens every 4 years at this point in a presidential race. And the answer is always the same. We don't know. And I think it's especially true this time. The polls are so tight. In some ways, I'm surprised by how tight they are. I come at this as somebody who covered the Republican primary. I covered the Haley campaign, and I heard from so many voters. These are, sort of centrist Republicans or conservative-leaning independents mostly who would come to Haley events, who said, I just don't like either of my options. I don't want Trump. I don't want Biden. My colleagues at NPR have covered the so-called double haters, which, there seem to be a lot of people who don't like either option. So, by one line of thinking, midsummer, those people got another option and the race is still tight. And I hear, from Trump supporters, much of what David was just describing. I was just listening to a focus group a few days ago with kind of center-right women in mostly Midwestern/swing states who were saying a lot of things like, I wish Trump would just be quiet. I don't like his tone, but the economy isn't what it used to be. Same kind of thing. Even one woman said, I understand you can argue that different ways. I understand that inflation is stabilized, but still I'm paying more than I used to pay. And I think that's the feeling for a lot of voters right now, wherever they are on the political spectrum. At the same time, I've also, the last few months, been covering efforts by the Harris campaign to reach out to the center. And I think this is one of the most marked differences between these two campaigns, is that Trump continues to be Trump. He is really fundamentally the same candidate he was 9 years ago when I started covering him. He is speaking primarily to the base, as much as his campaign and his aides might try to get him to speak more broadly, or he might try to temper his messaging on certain topics. He's Trump, and I think he will always be Trump, whereas Harris has been making a concerted effort. I was just in Bucks County on Wednesday when she was holding an event, flanked by dozens of Republicans who've endorsed her. Another reason you would think that maybe she should be doing better than she is. But, I think we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but I think there will be so many lessons learned from the exit polls in this campaign. There's so many questions, and this is such a dynamic time in politics.
I think the interesting, is this on?
Yeah, did you turn it on? Let's hear. Yeah, you just have to flip the top on.
Can you guys hear me now? There we go. Okay, perfect. Think I've never done this before. I agree. I think this, the campaigns are as tight as they could possibly get and doing completely different things at the same time, right? The folks that already like Trump, the kinds of people that already like Trump, even when you look at the in interviews, like the Theo Von podcast, that podcast with Andrew Schultz, I think is his name, right? Doubling down on men. Oh, is that better? Okay. Doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on folks who kind of already like him, while the Harris campaign, to the chagrin, I think, of some of the left-leaning folks in her party, is more looking to independents, even some of these Republicans. It was kind of a out-of-body experience, I think, for most of us watching Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris on a stage together, considering where our politics used to be just a couple of years ago. One of the things that I have found, I guess maybe most fascinating, is looking at the Black male vote and white women. So, the concern and the narrative has been for a long time that Black men are moving away from the Democratic Party, but they're still likely to vote in the 80 percentile for Vice President Harris in any way. But in a place like this, or in your state, any kind of shift would be really important and bad for her and Democrats. And on the Republican side, when you have the abortion rights and reproductive access at the top of a lot of women's heads and kind of freedom overall, what you're seeing is Republican women kind of struggle. Sometimes you'll talk to them and they're like struggling with how they're going to vote, right? They talk about their own economic how they feel about the economy in their house, right? How much money is coming in and out, how high the prices are. But then they think about Roe v. Wade, and they hear Vice President Harris and Democrats promising to do something on reproductive access if you give them the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And watching voters fight within themselves to get past the polarization that exists in our politics is, I think, really interesting because they don't often do that. And when it comes to the ground game, you talk to Republicans who are being honest about it, and they are concerned about Trump's ground game, right? He has never really felt the need to have a strong ground game, and this time around, he kind of outsourced it to a lot of other super PACs, right? And the Harris team, they're all about a ground game. I think here they have like 50 offices in Pennsylvania with 400 staff that are constantly in contact and running around and knocking on doors. And when you have a close election like that, history would tell us that you want a better ground game and you want a lot more money. The Harris campaign and Democrats are just like printing money right now and have been for a while, whereas Donald Trump is in New York in the less than 3 weeks to the election, still raising money, right? In a blue state, raising money this close kind of tells you that they know they're struggling there. At the end of the day, maybe none of the ground game actually matters, but history tells us that it will matter at some point. My colleague Holly Otterbein and Elena Schneider wrote a story this week that you guys should all read because it's about Pennsylvania, and it was like the Pennsylvania operation is just a mess. It was kind of the headline. And what I found really interesting reading that was not just that people complaining about Nikki Lou, who's the Pennsylvania campaign manager, but they were saying we're going to win in spite of them, which is something that Democrats, if you cover politics, Democrats are very whiny. Sorry, Democrats, but you are, and always concerned. And so if you have a Democrat saying we're going to win anyway, even though everything sucks, I don't know. That felt different to me than it usually does, which tells you they're not confident in the leadership, but confident that they can figure it out because of their own ground game. And you have all this anecdotal evidence. And I think of 2016 when people were saying, look at how big his crowd sizes are and look at all the yard signs. And that was anecdotal evidence that maybe something was happening. I think a lot of us were looking at the data like, no way. And then he won. And one of the reasons he won is because Hillary Clinton did not have good ground game. You know who did? Joe Biden. Joe Biden had a pretty good ground game in 2020. So the only person who has beat Donald Trump is someone with a good ground game. But he is very popular. This election's all over the place. We might have 54 more October surprises before all is said and done. And so it is, I know it's probably not helpful, but it is literally either of their race to win at this point and will remain so until the end.
Can you hear me? Does that work? Hello. Yeah, just to add to what Eugene said, one thing that I'm really paying attention to is the way the Harris campaign is contesting some of these counties in Pennsylvania that Democrats don't do well in. So a big tell for me is how hard they're contesting Erie County, which is in the Erie area, which is in the northwest corner of the state, right? Yeah. And so, Democrats traditionally in Pennsylvania, they run up huge numbers in the 4 counties outside Philadelphia, maybe Pittsburgh and Philly get good turnout from the base. But Biden won by shaving Trump's margins just by a couple points in some of these really out of the way places for Democrats. And what I'm hearing from Dems right now is that they're really encouraged by what they're seeing in those places. I mean, the Harris campaign is really penetrating to those areas very hard. And I think that they are really determined to contest every single vote in the rural areas as well. And that plus the kind of explosive numbers we're seeing, particularly among suburban women and college-educated whites, which are just astonishing numbers for Harris, I think. I mean, depending on the poll, you're just looking, some polls have her like 15 to 20 points up with college-educated whites, and that's just, it's staggering. I mean, she's hitting Biden's 2020 targets with white voters across the board now in most polls, which I think is surprising to a lot of people, not least Democrats, right? Um, and so, which brings me to the problem she faces, which is they're still not where they need to be with young voters and non-whites. And I think they know that, and they are putting immense resources into that right now. The non-traditional media tour she's taking is all about that as well. But there's a flip side again, not to go back and forth, but Trump's support, the top layer of his support, is kind of made up of these low propensity, young, non-white, drifting voters that you'd think are with Democrats. And one view I've heard, and I think is persuasive, is that support is kind of inherently soft, right? That at the last minute that either a lot of those people won't show up, or the Harris campaign will be able to get just enough of them back to kind of keep Trump at 47, 48%. Now, I'm not predicting a Harris victory. That's the sort of best case scenario. In fact, because you need more uncertainty right now, to add to what all these guys are saying, the polls could actually, even if they're just off a little bit, could mean a large victory for either campaign. So while I think the polls are right, like these guys do, I think that the race is essentially 50-50. But if the polls are wrong a little bit, all of a sudden you've got a whole different ballgame. So
Let me pick up on something that you were talking about, and I'll talk into this mic here. There's been a lot made, maybe a ton of reporting recently on Republicans making major inroads with communities of color, especially young male Latino men and Black men. Is that what your reporting is showing, or is this narrative somewhat overhyped?
I'll start. I don't think it's overhyped. I think people try to oversimplify it. One of the things that I did a story with one of my colleagues, Braxton Booker, earlier. I think it was this week. The days kind of bleed in now. So it could have been last month. But about this exact issue, especially with Black men. And what I heard from quite a few folks was that they felt like Black men were being scapegoated before the election actually started. Because again, like I said, they are going to vote as close to Black women as any other group, right? White men and white women are like this. Latino men and Latino women are like this. The same thing with Asians. And Black women and Black men actually vote as similar as you possibly can. The gender gap there is quite small comparatively. And they point to white women in 2016 and the way yes, I know Charlemagne the God, who's out there quite a bit talking. And talked to him before his interview with Vice President Harris this week, and he basically said like everyone's always talking to us, meaning Black men, when they should be talking, and we're not going to support a woman when the only evidence is that white women didn't in 2016 and voted more for Donald Trump in 2020. But there is an issue there. One of your city councilmen, I talked to him for our political podcasts that came out today, and he said that there's the same issue. He's talking to Black men. It's not that they are going to sprint over to, voting for Donald Trump, but that they might just stay home. And the Harris campaign, Vice President Harris herself, I've covered her this entire time as vice president, which is kind of head spinning considering how things have changed over the last few months. But she has always said that she's worried about losing to the couch, right? And so, when you talk to Black men, you're more likely to hear them say, I might stay home, other than them going to vote for Donald Trump. And at the same time, the issues they have aren't Harris specific. They're Democratic Party specific. And for years, maybe decades even, they have felt left behind by the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party has, when focusing on actual issues and the things that they pass, that Black men are at front of mind. And Quentin Folks, who's the principal deputy campaign manager for the Harris campaign, I talked to him for this story, and what he told me was that the party has, one, not done a great job at doing bills and talking about policy that's specific for Black men, and passing those kinds of things, but more importantly, not messaging it that way, and being scared that if you're a Democrat and you say this bill is to uplift Black men, that's bad. And so they're trying to change that. And this week, the Harris campaign release these kind of three policy prescriptions that are specifically tied to Black men. It's a little late in the process, I will say, to be throwing out new policies for people. But the issue is not Harris specific. She didn't create it, but it is her issue to kind of deal with. I think what you also hear from folks, Black men who are interested in Donald Trump, is that they like that he's tougher. They feel like they had more money in their pocket when he was president. They loved the checks that they got during the pandemic that had his name on it, right? And Biden didn't want to sign the checks. There's all the psychology that goes into into voting. But there's something there. I don't think anyone has an answer as to what. I think, like you said, the exit polls are going to tell us more than anything. But if we're watching the parties kind of realign in 2024, I mean, that's going to, for Democrats and Republicans, that's probably scary. But for us as reporters, I think it's like one of the most interesting aspects of this. If, all of a sudden a lot of Black men run to Republicans, what does that tell you about what happens in every election moving forward?
I thought it was so interesting to hear former President Obama not long ago, speak directly to this issue and basically say to Black men, look, you've got to get out and vote for her. And I think, it's hard to tease apart, but interesting to tease apart sort of what are the racial pieces of this, what are the gender pieces of this. I think some of it comes down to what Eugene was just saying. For decades, Democrats have done a really good job of speaking to women and to elevating women. And there are, I think, men of all races who feel left behind by that. At the same time, the issues, if you look at, the key issues in this campaign, things like immigration and the economy, I mean, those are obviously issues that scale across genders, but the strongest issue for Democrats, abortion, is seen as a woman's issue. So there's a bit of a split there. I think when it comes, this could obviously be a problem for Harris because she needs these diverse voters to turn out for her in significant numbers. In talking to some of the groups that are working on Republican outreach on behalf of Harris, one of the things they've said is we might lose some of those voters, but we are trying to reach these white college educated voters who are really reliable voters. They vote. So if we can win them over, it might counterbalance some of the loss in other groups. That's what they say to me.
Look, I think it's important to remember that we take for granted that certain demographics only vote one way because that's what we're used to. But that isn't the case, right? Over time, there are often shifts, or there are elections where there's a shift, right? I mean, George W. Bush in 2004, I think he hit 40%, maybe 44% with Hispanic voters. And so there are times where there's a particular candidate with particular appeal. And Donald Trump has an appeal with working class voters and not just white working class voters. And he has now been the dominant Republican in America for almost a decade. And so he doesn't shock people anymore the way he used to. He doesn't scare a lot of people the way he used to. And when we're in the middle of rough economic times, as far as people can tell from their own situation, when you have a candidate who's offering a difference, then they're going to look past typical partisan affiliations because the economy is everything for people when it has to do with eating and maybe taking one vacation or maybe just feeling like you have a couple extra bucks in the bank to get by from week to week. I mean, it's like a really big deal for people. I should note that in 2020, Donald Trump won Zapata County, a border county in Texas, overwhelmingly Hispanic. 4 years earlier had voted for Hillary Clinton by, I think, 50 points, the norm, right? A Republican had not won that county in 100 years. And so Donald Trump has a really interesting cross-class appeal, and in part because he is not, he is not a Reagan-era Republican who talks about smaller government and taking government programs and letting the states handle it all, right? I mean, he's running around offering to cut taxes on, eliminate the tax on tips. If you work in the service industry, he's now saying he'll make the interest on car loans tax deductible, and a number of these sort of populist economic policies that are going to make people go, I mean, that might save me some money, and I actually need some money. I would say, though, that often we cover these emerging trends and we find out it's just moving slower than we think. I mean, in 2020, the Trump campaign with the Republican National Committee did a ton of work in the Black community with these community centers they were very proud of, that they opened in Black neighborhoods. And they were hoping, at least among Black men, to get up to 12 to 14% of the vote, and they came nowhere near that. But I could see a scenario where, let's say Trump hits that this time. You could almost say that it was 8 years of work that finally produced a result that was significant enough to have an impact on the election. And so when you look at these through the broad sort of, when you look at it over a long period of time rather than with just one election, then you can kind of have an understanding of what's going on.
And just sorry, real quick, you also can't underestimate, especially with men, kind of the ubiquitousness that Donald Trump has had in our culture for probably all of your life and most of ours. When you think about, The Apprentice, when you think about him looking tough and telling people you're fired and kind of being, at the time, kind of just like everyone's like crazy uncle that said like wild stuff. You know what I mean? That was how a lot of people grew up with him. But at the heart of that was what ends up being a myth when you actually like look into it, is that he's this amazing businessman, right? And that he's good with money and that he understands how to get rich. And part of the way voters often think about these things is they see themselves in candidates. And if there's probably almost every voter will probably tell you who's thinking about maybe waffling on either side, that they see themselves as someone who can also be a millionaire or billionaire, right? That the American dream that is promised to all of us is that we're all going to be rich and like follow all of our dreams, when we know that's like not true. Like that's not how it actually ends up working. And so you have a lot of voters, when you talk to them, saying like, he does that, I think I can. That makes me feel like I can too. One, that shows you that, that myth that has been built is deep within the psyche of people. Two, it tells you, it also gives them hope, to something to strive for. And three, it makes it really hard for Democrats to fight something like that. Because if you look at someone and say, this person's amazing and he makes me feel like I can be amazing, like it's hard to fight against something like that. And I think with men, they look at a tough guy, someone who tells it like it is, who doesn't care about what other people think, who is rich and getting richer. That is something that is really appealing to a lot of men, includes men across the board.
I just want to add one thing too. We look at Barack Obama's support with non-white voters in 2008 and 2012, and I think you guys may not look at it this way, but I think it became ingrained in the sort of political psyche of political professionals that, oh, well, this is the kind of percentage of non-white voters that Democrats get. And that's just the way it is. And it doesn't matter. Obama, Clinton, pick your candidate you never heard of, and that's the way it's going to be. In fact, it wasn't like Democrats were excelling with non-white voters before Obama, but not to that level. And what we found is they're not excelling with non-white voters to Obama's level after Obama. They still do extremely well. And in fact, when we talk about movement that could impact the race adversely for Harris, she's still going to win Black men overwhelmingly. She's still going to win non-white voters generally, like overwhelmingly. But in a race that's a jump ball, the shift of 1% here or 3% there, a half a point over there, can make a really big difference. And in fact, the fight that these two candidates are having for these percentages are sort of, in a way, even though it's being done differently than maybe 30 years ago, is more normal. Obama was an unusually strong politician, both with white voters and non-white voters, but in particular with non-white voters. And I think sometimes we forget that.
I'd just like to add something about the Latino vote, which we haven't discussed yet. I do think that the loss of non-white support among Democrats is a real thing. But I don't know how real it is. And I think we don't know that. And one of the reasons we don't know that yet is because of regional variation, which is a big, big factor with Latinos. You may have seen the big New York Times Siena poll of Latino voters. Did you all see that? I think it had Harris at around 57, 58% of Latinos nationally. But if you look in the crosstabs, and that's dangerous business, but you can't help it. I mean, let's face it.
youngsters cringe there.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it. We're looking in the crosstabs right now. She had 64% among Latinos in the West, which I took to be potentially an important number. Obviously, there's a big danger with smaller samples and stuff like that, but that's actually kind of plausible that her support would be a little higher in the West among Latinos than nationally, because you're really getting some distortions out of Florida partly and places, and I think partly Texas as well. You know, the race that somebody talked about earlier today where Trump won a border county, border district, right. And so I think we just don't really know yet how much the Latino drift is going to matter. I think the Arizona polling suggests it might, and I don't think we know what's going on, why she tends to be around 1 to 2 points behind in Arizona, yet up a point in Nevada. Maybe Arizona has a larger population of non-college whites, something like that. I don't know those demographics very well, but in some ways Arizona is a little bit more hospitable to a Republican than Nevada is, and Nevada has very organized, you know, labor on the ground and stuff like that. But I think you could see the Latino vote actually not mattering as much as we expect in the Western states. Still think Arizona is going to be tough for Harris, but I don't know that she needs it to win. So anyway, and by the way, there's one other thing that's worth keeping in mind, which is that George W. Bush did very well with Latinos also.
David was saying that.
Yeah.
I could just say one thing about the Latino vote that I think we don't fully understand yet, but we're starting to understand and is worth paying attention to is the role of religion. You know, I cover religion and politics, and I've written a lot about white evangelicals. We talk a lot about the white evangelical Republican Party base, but as the Latino population in this country gets larger, more diverse, you have, you know, second, third, fourth, and beyond generation Latinos who are less tied to their, you know, maybe great grandparents' country of origin, more immersed in the dominant American culture. And there's, you know, I think historically we've thought about Latinos as being predominantly Catholic, but increasingly they're evangelical. And there's a tremendous cross-pollination between white evangelical culture and Latino evangelical culture in the U.S. I mean, we're talking about the same sort of influencers, for lack of a better word, Christian school curricula, the kinds of songs that are sung in churches and books that are read and passed around in the community. And so I don't think we fully understand that yet, but I think I would hypothesize that it's an important piece of the shift toward the Republican Party and will continue to be.
I could add one quick point there. I think also the gender gap is going to matter very much with Latino voters as well. Obviously, we already talked about the gains that Trump is making among men, especially young men of color. And what I hear from Democratic organizers fairly regularly is that they're absolutely shocked at how resonant reproductive rights is for young Latino women. I'm really hearing that quite a bit. And I think in the Times poll, or at least there have been some polls of Latinos nationally and stuff that show Harris not where she needs to be, maybe 57, 56, 58%. That's not high enough. But you start to look at the subgroups, other subgroups like women and younger women, and there's really, you know, tremendous support for her among those constituencies. So I think a big thing, this is a long way of saying that one thing that will decide this is whether Democrats can just pull back a few of those young men somehow, or maybe if that demographic doesn't show up in the numbers that Trump needs. That's the kind of thing that I'm really expecting to be potentially decisive.
There's a lot of threads that I want to kind of pick up on in what you're saying. But let's start with the last one that Greg just brought up, which is the gender gap. And maybe it's a gender chasm at this point. But what's driving it, and what do you think the impact will be of that?
I mean, I'm the only woman on the panel, so I'll briefly reiterate. You know, I think some of it is the issues at stake, but like as I mentioned earlier, abortion is it's an issue that motivates the traditional Democratic Party base in general. I mean, voters of color, younger voters, and women all show put a higher priority on the abortion issue, but I think it's particularly salient for women for obvious reasons. Again, I think it's some of the cultural things we've all talked about in terms of the way that the parties and the candidates are appealing to masculinity versus femininity, and you know, this sort of symbolism around those ideas, and who feels like they're being spoken to and who feels like they're not being spoken to by each party. it's a widening gap. I think, I think Politico had a piece a few years ago about the dating gap, and it's an absolutely fascinating trend. And I don't know. At some point, there has to be a ceiling on it, right? But I'm not sure where that is.
I don't necessarily. I don't think we know yet what's driving it this time beyond what Sarah just mentioned. But I will tell you, I remember in 2018 in the midterm elections then that in focus groups, female voters would talk about having to turn off the TV when their kids were in the room if Trump was on because they didn't know what he was going to say or how he was going to act. And I think there's I think that his style just happens to rub more women the wrong way than men. Now, I will caveat that by saying that across the board, Trump's numbers are better than they have ever been in his entire political career. He is still generally underwater, fave, unfave, but by much smaller margins than he has ever been. In vote share in a lot of these polls, in some of them, he's still at 45, 46, which is, usually been his ceiling, but we've seen him approach 47, 48, if he's not winning in some other polls. And so we don't know for sure how this is going to shake out. Otherwise, we'd be able to give you a better prediction or a prediction on the race. But for lack of a better term, statesmanship, I think, may matter to women in a way, to more women than it does to men, even though it does matter to men, but I think in lower numbers.
It's also like character, right? Like there's this that's part of it, and it's one Trump style, but also like the things that he says, right? Like he often is not saying very nice things about women, right? Like that's something that has been a part of his career. I think about the very first debate that he ever did, and Megyn Kelly kind of lists off all the things that he had called women. And that has continued, right? That hasn't stopped. You look at the way that he talks about Vice President Harris. Now he says some messed up things about President Biden as well. But I think the thing that's interesting, recently he was talking about kind of basically whether or not he thought they were smart, and he said President Biden got old and dumb, and Harris maybe she was born dumb. Was kind of like the gist there, and I see women shaking their head like that is a dog whistle to say like the man got dumb because he got old, but the woman, like this is just how women are born, right? So when I talked to women about that afterward, that was something that resonated with them, right? Those kinds of things actually matter. How much that actually matters when they go into the voting booth is hard to tell. But those issue sets I think are huge.
It's particularly in keeping with how he talks about Black women.
Exactly. I mean, yes, exactly. Like that, Black women are not. There's a very small minority of Black women who are going to vote for Donald Trump. And the thing that's really interesting, David, what you just said that made me think of it is the Harris of now. If you look at her numbers now and Donald Trump of 2020 or 2016, we would probably feel like she's in a landslide. She'd probably be in a landslide, right? But he is continuing to be more popular, which means you'd think he'd be doing even better than he is right now.
Yeah. I wanted to add too, I think this is the only way I can get away with saying this, but I think it's important because likability matters a lot.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going to happen, but as I was talking to Democrats last week in Pennsylvania about the differences between 2016 and 2024, they said, look, I liked Hillary, but a lot of doors that I would knock on with Democratic voters didn't like her. She had endured, 25 years of negative advertising, criticism from the right. But at the end of the day, even a lot of Democrats did not like her. They are not running into that with Vice President Harris. And I would just argue she's actually a likable candidate. And I think she is a more likable politician than she was in her first presidential run, and then she would often appear to be as vice president before she was the presidential candidate. But who cares what I think? What they're hearing at the doors is she's okay. I like her. She's interesting. I think that's why you're seeing so much grassroots enthusiasm for her. But I've had Democrats compare her to the last Democratic female nominee, and it's night and day how Democratic voters think of her.
I mean, when you cover politics like we do, race is a really important part of it. Like if you don't care about race in this country, like you probably shouldn't be covering politics. It's such an integral part of how people think of things. You would think that it would be the opposite, right? That the immense amount of racism that Black women have faced, currently face, and will continue to face in this country, would be pulling Vice President Harris down a lot more. It seems like that's not the case, right? We're seeing the racism, we're seeing the sexism, but I think a lot of people, a lot of Black women who are in politics who I talk to are surprised how much of it is not an issue, right? And I don't know what it tells us about the future of politics. I don't think we fixed racism and sexism in 2024. Color me skeptical. But it does tell you that there's a way to be a politician and kind of go beyond the things that people often think as would hold you back with certain types of voters. It also speaks to how people feel about Donald Trump, right? Like even the people on the left who would typically be fighting with Harris on pick an issue, they're very quiet, right? Like progressives have been very quiet as she has been the nominee. The issue of Gaza is still humongous, but then when even the folks in Michigan, the uncommitted people, when they refused to endorse her, they said, we're not going to endorse her, but don't vote for Donald Trump, right? So like what? And don't vote for third party. So what does that tell you to do, right? And so it's like even the progressives who have issues with who she is, the kind of policies that she cares about. She's basically, people are waiting to fight with her, I think, on January 20th, 2025, when those things happen.
Just want to add a point about what David said. I don't think we really appreciate the stark difference in favorability versus unfavorability between Harris and Hillary Clinton in another way. I mean, as you said, that her negatives got built up over the years, but I mean, it was really like, it was driven into voters' heads for over 2 decades that they shouldn't like this person, right? And you had the baking cookies thing, which resonated for many, many years, probably longer than it should have, but that's one of those things. It meant something to a lot of people, apparently. But it's a sort of weird perversity or an irony that Harris seems to be benefiting from the fact that she entered the race so late, and that that the president and his team actually didn't put her out there all that much. I mean, I don't really know whether she'd be in a better situation now politically if they had done that, if they had put her out there more than they did. But, it's possible that she wouldn't, right? And by the way, there's one other thing we should mention, which is that Republican operatives and Trump advisors, you guys may remember this, I think you guys reported on it in particular, they were telling Trump, stop with the personal attacks on Harris. And these are Republicans who, presumably know how to win elections and look at data, right? I mean, his own advisors, we saw a whole spate of stories, maybe in July or something like that, where they were just trying in every which way to get that message across to Trump. You're killing yourself among women if you keep attacking her. And he went out at a rally and he attacked his own advisors, if you remember that, and said, I shouldn't even be paying these guys. They should be fired. And he just, kept it up. And I don't know, you look at his relatively high favorability ratings compared to where he was in the past, and maybe you think he knows something we don't. But on the other hand, I think those high favorability ratings are probably an artifact of how weirdly absent he's been from the news, at least, through the spring and summer, relative to the kind of exposure he gets as president. I mean, his negatives seem to go up kind of in proportion to how often you kind of see that big red face screaming at you. You know what I mean? And so, like, stuff from his trials, which I think should matter, just doesn't, as much as his kind of daily, kind of drumbeat of weirdly deranged stuff. And so, I don't know. I think that in the end, his advisors are probably right when it really comes down to it. His favorabilities are higher than they have been. But again, as you said, gender chasm. And we're really seeing tons and tons of resources going into reaching these women. This is not something we haven't talked about. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this. I mean, Liz Cheney campaigning for Harris is by itself is a pretty remarkable thing, but you've got a whole parade of Republicans out there campaigning for her. And you've got immense resources going into reaching these voters.
Sarah's covering this stuff, I know.
Yeah. I mean, right, you have these huge resources going into reaching these Republican-leaning independent women. I got to think that matters, doesn't it?
It's the campaign, they hired, and they're not solely focused on women, but women are an important part of that strategy, probably the most important part of it. They hired a former Adam Kinzinger chief of staff to run their Republican outreach. And then there is a host of PACs and ancillary groups that are working on different pieces of Republican outreach, including some specifically to Republican women. And they're very laser focused on the places they think it will matter. In some cases, it's a pocket of 100,000 women in Pennsylvania, 150,000 in Georgia, North Carolina. Just one other thing I would say about the gender piece of it that I think is so interesting is I don't think that Harris has leaned into her gender or her race in terms of her messaging in the same way that Hillary Clinton did her gender. I mean, if you remember, there was that campaign slogan, "I'm with her." It was sort of a big feature of her, the way she pitched herself to voters. Harris, of course, has talked to women's groups, to African American groups, but her message has very much tacked to the center and has seemed very strategically designed to appeal to a broad swath of the country. And I wonder how much of that, I mean, I wouldn't minimize the many, many years of attacks on Clinton. I think that's probably the biggest piece of this. But to me, they sound very different when they talk about identity.
What's interesting about Harris is that's not new. She actually has never leaned in to her identity. And you would intuitively think that you would want to, right? But she came up in California, right? So she was a Democrat in California. If you're smart and you're a good politician, you're probably going to win. So she, did not have to differentiate herself in that way. And something that LaFonza Butler, who's currently a senator, used to work for Harris, told me at the DNC, we did these live events, and I asked her this question because it was a question that a lot of white people had, which was like, why isn't she talking about being a black woman? Like, she's a black woman. Talk about being a black woman, be history. And what she said is something that I assumed and had talked to my mother and grandmother and aunts about, which is black women in this country are always going to be reminded they're black women. Like all of us, the royal us, will remind her that she's a black woman over and over and over again. And so she doesn't have to go around talking about it. Obvious. Even the day that she accepted her nomination, everybody was wearing white, and everyone was like, what is she gonna wear? Is she gonna wear white? And she wore like a dark navy suit, right? And what that tells you, one, is that Harris is always going to do something that kind of maybe surprises you a little bit when people are expecting something. But it also, what her allies and aides were saying is she sees it as like she can wear white when she's done, right? When in 2020 they won, she wore white. She hadn't worn white up until that point, right? So it's like little things like that. But if you're paying attention to how she talks about her background, all of the identity stuff is in there, right? She talks about being an AKA, right? She talks about going to Howard University. She talks about how her mom raised her and her sister Maya to be strong black women, right? I guess it's the opposite of a dog whistle, but it's like it's for the people who need to hear it, right? It's like for black people and women to be like, okay, I hear that, I see that, without maybe alienating people to where if her identity is not an issue, it's something that they don't want to hear about, because that is still a big part of the way that people work in politics nowadays.
I just wanted to add on the Republican outreach. What I find interesting are two things. One, from my reporting, and I'm sure from all of you guys, like it's actually a real thing. So what we see a lot of times in campaigns, and it's fine, but it's like they'll have Republicans for so and so or Democrats for so and so, and there's a who do I talk to at the campaign, and they give you some press person, and it's not actually a real effort. It's just a couple of events, and they're supposed to call their friends, and really it's about fundraising. This is an actual campaign where they're using the voters that supported Nikki Haley over Donald Trump in the primaries in the swing states as a target market. And it's not that they have Austin Weatherford, who's Kinzinger's old chief of staff, who at least is a Republican who knows how Republicans think. But they have targeted advertising. They have targeted door to door within each state. They've got a group of Republicans that are doing the outreach, and they're actually putting real resources into this. And for those of you, I don't know, like for those of you in the room who are like not nearly as old as me, we actually used to see candidates move to the center in the general election as a regular thing. And in the era of base politics, by the way, we saw this with Obama in 08, but not Obama in 12. He just maximized his support with the Democratic base and independents. And of course, the coalitions were slightly different then to win re-election. But ever since then, it's been Donald Trump trying to maximize his base, and even Joe Biden, who people think of as a centrist, but that's just because he seemed like a nice guy. He actually isn't a centrist, never has been a centrist, and ran a base, this is my opinion, I could be wrong, but a largely base campaign. I'm not criticizing it. He won. Harris is doing something we used to see in the 80s and 90s, which is you win the primary, obviously different for her, and then you kind of go to the center. And I just think it's fascinating to see because, I don't know, it's like if some football team was running a single wing again. I'd probably watch just because I haven't seen that in 50 years.
You need to explain the single wing to the.
Yeah, it's not a quarterback behind center. You have like two running backs, but one of them gets the hike and it's a whole thing. So you see what I mean? That's what I mean. So this is actually really different and it may really work, but I can't actually say, 4 years ago this worked or, when it happened 8 years ago, I just think it's fascinating, but they are really putting real resources into this. She's really leaning into it. I'm pretty convinced it's one of the reasons she picked Tim Walz rather than Shapiro, because if the nominee is going to go to the center, you need to reassure the base who does matter that you're not abandoning them, and that's what Tim Walz did.
So let me start pulling some of the audience questions. Seeing a lot of questions in here about the campaign strategies, independents versus base turnout, and what they're trying to do to appeal to independents. So if you could kind of talk about the strategies and where they're trying to win this campaign over the last 2.5 weeks.
I guess I'll start. I mean, this sort of overlaps with what David was saying, but one thing that's very different today from just about any other campaign that we remember in our lifetimes is that the Republican candidate tried to overturn an election and sparked mob violence and so forth. That plus Dobbs, which is also something that is unprecedented, it's a transformation of decades of American life into something else. Those two things really create a genuine opportunity for this outreach to the center. If you talk to Sarah Longwell, which I do regularly, Sarah Longwell, for those of you who don't know, I guess she's not a Republican anymore. Do you know? Is she still a Republican?
A conservative, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Republican voters, I guess. She herself one, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know either.
She was a Republican. We know.
She
From
absolutely was a
Pennsylvania.
Republican. Yeah, right. She's from Central PA, right? Isn't she?
Right.
Yeah, and so if you talk to her, she is sort of presiding over. She does regular focus groups of these types of voters you're talking about: independents, right-leaning moderates, Republican women, those types, right? Probably mostly white collar, somewhat upscale, maybe not always though. That kind of demographic, and she reports back that all this stuff about Trump, the stuff we're talking about here, obviously the crudeness and the attacks on women, but also the legal stuff really matters to these voters a lot. The economy is weighing on them as well, but she reported to me recently that she now has these voters starting to, and I'd love to hear what you guys, whether you're picking up this in your reporting as well. She told me that these voters are now starting to say they think Harris's economic policies would be better for them, which I think may explain why she's getting nearer to parity on the economy. Getting close. I don't think she's quite there. In some polls, she's kind of 50, even with Trump on that. But anyway, I think this is why she's closing it. One other thought I had is, I do think that for these voters, in the battle for these voters, Democratic operatives really used 2012 in a weird way as a touchstone. In 2012, you may remember, Obama was underwater on the economy because he was, bringing the country back from the Great Recession and so forth. And Romney had the advantage. He was clearly favored throughout much of that race on who can be trusted to manage the economy. But Democrats that I talk to think that that question is kind of narrow, that it's kind of technocratic. This idea that managing the economy is the metric that matters. They think that what really matters, or at least matters just as much in the battle over the economy, is which voter is on your, which candidate is on your side, which one is aware of the problems that you face. David Plouffe, other Obama advisors in 2012 would tell anyone who would listen. I listened. I don't think a lot of people did listen at the time, though. I don't know if you remember, but they were telling people like us regularly that metric will matter more than the economic approval number, economic trust number. And they were right about that. So, this is why I think Trump constantly says, oh, Harris didn't work at McDonald's. Like, that's not just some crazy thing he's throwing out there. He knows that it's a problem if these swing voters that we're talking about get it into their heads that she understands where people like them are coming from. And that's really, I think, the battle right now is over whether Republicans can kind of paint Harris as this kind of alien elite, out of touch figure, or whether she can be the middle class kid and daughter of immigrants who, understands where all these people are coming from. So that's what I think is going on with that battle right now.
I mean, the strategy from the Harris campaign is to try to get everybody, right? Which is like, she doesn't have a coalition, right? That's not something that she had. We've never seen her in a primary, right? Other than being the vice president. And so what they are focused on is the fact that there are a lot of voters who, even if they're Republicans, even if they voted for Donald Trump, will say January 6th was uncomfortable at best for them, or at least for them, that his attempts to subvert the will of the American people in 2020 was a problem. The way that he talks is the problem. And so that's why you have someone like Liz Cheney getting on stage with Harris, because their whole thing that day was country over party, right? That you may not like Harris's policy prescriptions, but she's going to follow the law. She says she's going to respect the Constitution, and we can tussle about the health care, and we can tussle about economic policy and immigration policy after the fact. Immigration policy, if you look at that, speaking of, is exactly the policy that you started to see. Oh, this is a campaign that is really like about the middle, right? It's really about convincing the people right here to get on her side, because she, first of all, talked about it. And Democrats don't talk about immigration, or more importantly, don't talk about stronger border enforcement, right? That was something. I was in Arizona with her. It was like 15,000 people, first of all, in a convention center, which was crazy to see. And she talked about making sure that the border was secure, but she also talked about a pathway to citizenship. When I talked to Arizona Republicans, what they said was, the bar is really low for Democrats on some of these issues, immigration being one of them. If you just say, I care about it, I'm going to do something, even if you're not specific, and Harris has been pretty specific. If you say you're not specific, they're probably going to give you quite a bit, right? They're going to say, oh, this is something, this feels different. Joe Biden didn't do this, right? Hillary Clinton didn't talk about this. Barack Obama didn't talk about the border as much as I would like them to. And so that's one thing. Also, every time that this gun, she has this gun, everyone knows she got a Glock. She'll shoot you if you roll up in a house. She already says that. Secret Service will shoot you first, but sure. Um, but even that is to tell people, I'm not some San Francisco liberal, right? That I understand your need to protect your family, right? And what you hear from people who, folks consider responsible gun owners, is that I got it to protect my family. And so that's what she's signaling there. That's what she's telling people, that she understands that. And when Harris started talking about her gun, what was really fascinating is that the gun rights groups didn't start saying oh my God, that Kamala Harris and that gun. What they started saying was, and started doing is, the Giffords campaign, Gabby Giffords, gun rights, gun safety organization, created Gun Owners for Harris, which is wild that that is something that Democrats are working on, which is a group of, in their minds, responsible gun owners around the country who are going around knocking on doors for Vice President Harris. And I think that's another really good example of a campaign that is maybe being creative at the very least, at trying to be in the middle. Is I'll shoot you in front of Oprah, of all people. I'll shoot you if you roll over my house. and 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 like then the Giffords campaign is like, okay, we're on board, right? So like that, it is a mindset shift within not just this campaign, but maybe even in the Democratic Party, that maybe you can do things you couldn't do before. And so that tactic and that strategy is within the Harris campaign. The Trump campaign strategy is to double, triple down on the people that have voted for him, because he thinks there's more of them out there, right? They're doing some persuasion stuff, but a lot of it is juicing up people who were already interested in thinking about voting for him, maybe had voted for him. Go get your friends that maybe didn't vote for me, but might be interested. I think that that is their main goal. They are trying to shave off numbers, especially with Black men and Latino men, as we've talked about. But juicing up young men and men overall is a really important part of the Trump strategy.
I'm going to, if I may, just slightly take this forward one tick, because I think the answer to what is the strategy for independence is very similar to the answer that I've articulated already about the strategy for reaching moderate Republicans, which is, speaking. If I had to summarize it, I would say, there are two main messages. One is Trump bad, and two is Harris good. And Trump bad it's a different message this time around than it was from the Never Trumpers 4 years ago because of January 6th. But to take it a tick forward, what I'm curious about is whether these kinds of efforts, the ways that Democrats and Harris's allies have had to get creative, whether those pay off and pay dividends for Democrats going forward at a time when, as we mentioned at the beginning, there is such dynamism around our politics. There's, such an inversion of expectations when it comes to certain voting groups. Does that pay off? There's an argument to be made that Democrats should have done that a long time ago. I mean, I've gone, to many, many Republican rallies, Trump rallies, and you hear things quite often like the Democrats want to take all our guns away, which, may be an outlier position, but is really not in line with most policies that have been proposed by most Democrats. And yet there are a lot of misconceptions out there. So, do those kinds of messaging strategies that have been employed this time around, do they pay off in the future? Do they reshape the parties in some way?
I'll just say these, and Eugene got into this. The two campaigns are running completely different campaigns for the most part, right? So Harris is trying to build a broad coalition. She's reaching out to the center. And what Trump is doing is energizing his base and trying to expand his base by going out and finding voters that if they were Americans, that if they vote, if they participate in the election, are more likely to vote for him or candidates like him and support policies like the ones that he talks about. And this has been very intentional in the door knocking strategy of the center right groups that are doing what the Republican National Committee used to do until Trump redirected everything. And so they're not necessarily knocking on doors of reliable Republicans to make sure they're getting their ballot in, although some of that is happening. What they're doing in particular is working off of a universe of what they call low propensity voters, people who have only in the last 4 elections participated once or twice. But if they could just get them to the polls, are more likely than not to vote for Trump. And so he runs the same campaign he's always ran. I think that's why we haven't talked about him as much in this discussion. It's just because it's not new. It's not as interesting. It doesn't mean it's wrong or bad or that he won't win. It's just the same thing we've all been writing about for like 10 years. And she's like what she's doing is just new and different. But what he's doing is a strategy, right? It's not, Trump doesn't know what he's doing. He just goes and he talks. Well, part of what Trump does is just because he's like a walking id. But there's also a strategy to it. Trump knows what he's talking about and who he's talking to. And it's one of the reasons why they brought Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into the campaign. Obviously RFK Jr. had to be willing to go into the campaign, but they're looking for those non-traditional voters, the voters that think, all these insiders, they're all the same. But, once every 25 or 30 years, there's a Ross Perot, or in 2016, there's a Donald Trump. who I can get behind because they're just not a politician. And even though RFK Jr. is a figure that's been around forever in his family name, has been around forever in politics, he's this, weird guy who doesn't believe in vaccines and a whole bunch of other things. And so that's why the Trump campaign is sending him all over the country with Tulsi Gabbard to go talk to groups because they're trying to activate people who usually don't participate. Now, will it work? We talked about the risks that Harris is taking. A low propensity voter is a low propensity voter for a reason. They don't participate all that often. And so sometimes they're just interested in listening to you, but at the end of the day, like, whatever, I have better things to do today. Or, oh, maybe I'll mail this in. I don't know. I mean, they're not as,
On election day.
Yeah.
right. Now, but if it works, listen, if whoever wins everything they did, they're going to be like geniuses. And then the losing campaign is like, can you believe they did that? What dummies. But honestly, it's one of those things.
One of the things that's really interesting and is a perfect example of like maybe the people who write about politics and pay attention to politics, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and reporters, shows maybe sometimes we don't know what we're talking about. The other day when Trump was on stage and he kind of just for like 35 minutes just like DJ'd. I don't know if you guys saw that. And he was like, Pavarotti, play louder. Which for us, we were like, what the hell is happening? You know what I mean? It was like, we didn't understand what was going on. It was supposed to be a town hall. He answered like 2 questions and honestly, objectively, like not well. And he just like DJ'd up there. And so everything on Twitter/X and kind of like what was on television and what we all wrote the next day and that night was like, that was so weird. But everybody that was there that I talked to, the reporters, they spoke to people and they were like, that was fine. I didn't think it was that weird. We just listened to music for a while with the guy that we like, right? And so, which like for us was like, it's like really hard to be like that, but like, no, but it was weird, right? You came to a political rally, but they don't see him as like a political figure. They see him as
Been to 400 like we have.
right, exactly. They're like, is this how it always is? This is great. I love Pavarotti, I guess.
Yeah, no, so we've reached the point of the program where I try to get ambitious and squeeze questions in. The first one I want to get to, one of the questions from the audience, we haven't talked at all about the House and Senate and where things are going down ballot. So if we could kind of give people some insight into what to look for down ballot, that would help flesh out the picture, I guess.
Okay, I'll try. So I don't really see how Democrats can hold the Senate at this point. It actually looked like there was a plausible path for them for a while there. Maybe they get a surprise in Texas or even Florida, and all these red state Democrats hang on. But Tester's in serious trouble, it looks like to me now. I guess Sherrod Brown probably hangs on. Maybe. Very hard to tell. But even if he does, I'm still not, I don't think Texas or Florida are plausible at this point. You guys would probably, you guys cover that more closely than I do, but it just doesn't look plausible to me. The House, I was actually talking to a Democrat about this today, and he was saying, we can see a range of scenarios here. His gut was saying a 4-seat majority for Democrats was kind of what he was saying.
That would be an 8-seat pickup.
Yeah, and the reason he was saying this, it's a Democrat I trust. He was not predicting it. He was saying that if I really had to guess, gun to the head, this is what I'd guess. And he was saying, the polling that we look at in the battleground, he's doing better than expected. Harris is doing better than expected. Not a wait. This is what he said, not a wait, which I took to mean something important. I think Republicans have put a lot of money into making her a wait on these down ballot candidates. And I think for a while there was definitely reason to think it could work. David, you probably talk to House GOP operatives a whole lot more than I do. They don't return my calls. But anyway, so he was sort of cautiously optimistic while also kind of conceding, look, things can go wrong and we can see, a significantly bad day for us. But anyway, that was where he was. I mean, obviously, so much of this turns on the big unknown of the presidential, right? This is like another layer of unknown. But I guess there's a path to holding to winning the House if Harris wins. It seems like there's a path there.
Yeah, there's a path, and I'm not as in touch with the House race as I normally am, just because of the presidential. The Senate is easy enough to see, and between Montana and West Virginia, the Senate majority that Democrats have is in very big trouble because the West Virginia race is a fait accompli. And Tester's never been in trouble like this. Since he won in 2006, he was always in a sort of, it was narrow sometimes, but it was commanding, and he's just not there. And the Republicans nominated a very good normie sort of Republican. And the state is just a red state by and large. Trump's going to win that state by, what, 15 points? Even if he only wins it by 12. That's just a lot to outrun. And Democrats, look, they are in trouble. I don't mean in trouble. What I mean is there are competitive Senate races in Democratic held seats in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. And Ohio, if anybody can outrun Trump at 8 points or Trump at +10, it's Brown, but it's tough. Wisconsin turned into something competitive that nobody expected because Tammy Baldwin is usually stronger. And nobody wanted on the Republican side Eric Hovde. They just couldn't get anybody else. So the Democrats are in trouble in the Senate. And the House is just, it's harder to gauge. It's harder to gauge.
I'm much more engaged with the presidential campaign than Congress, but one thing I'll say, I think probably the most interesting thing one of my sources has said, sort of center-left sources, is if essentially control flips and Democrats take the House and Republicans take the Senate, and if Harris were to win, that might be a situation in which Congress might actually get some things done. Was this source's hypothesis, because you'd have probably Hakeem Jeffries, who's sort of a centrist Democrat, as Speaker. Senate Republicans are known for being a little more willing to work together than House Republicans, and then you'd have a Democratic president. You know, perhaps something like the immigration deal that died a few months ago would be resurrected. Total speculation, but it'll be interesting to see.
I mean, the House, I think, Democrats in 2022 did not do well in New York, which people were really surprised by. But when I talk to folks in New York on the ground now, they feel like they're going to get back what they need there. And if they just kind of keep, status quo in most, if not all of the states, and then flip New York where they want it, the House is done, right? So it's like it's easier, just as easy it is for Republicans to win the Senate, it's easier for Democrats to win the House. And I mean, we talked to someone on the Harris campaign, who's probably going to work in a presidential or work for Harris as a president. They'll tell you they'd rather win the Senate because nominations, right? And so what you guys are going to want to pay a lot of attention to, whatever ends up happening, if Harris wins and loses and Democrats lose the Senate, like, one, a lot of the people who are probably in the cabinet now may have to stick around because it is going to be hard to push through, if not impossible to push through a nomination through that Republican Senate. And, the Senate doesn't care what the House does anyway. So, like, a lot of the bills are going to be coming out of the Senate, right? Like, the House will pass something and the Senate's like, that's cute. And then they do something else, right? And so that's the Senate is where all the power really is.
So my last big picture question here, someone asked, where does the GOP go from here if Trump loses?
Well,
He gets the hard ones.
if Trump loses,
Yeah.
well, first, it depends on whether or not Trump runs for president again in 2028.
Not kidding. No.
No, because if Trump runs for president again in 2028, I think a lot of Republicans will look back on 2024 and say, why am I going to put myself through that if this guy's got a lock on the base? And if Trump loses, he will say that it was rigged and stolen, because that just, going all the way back to his loss in the Iowa caucuses in 2016 to Ted Cruz, he always says it was rigged and stolen. And I think he believes it, but it doesn't matter whether he believes it or not. So first, there will be that. Second of all, there will be people encouraging him to remain as at least the putative leader of the Republican Party. nobody close to him will say that it's time to retire to private life and, you know, be proud of the fact that he was president of, you know, the most powerful country on the face of the earth. And so he will continue to endorse in primaries. He will continue, I think, to be sought after by people who want to win primaries. And I think that when Republicans in Congress, for instance, look ahead to 2026 with Harris in the White House, they'll say, it's a midterm with a Democrat in the White House. And yes, I know it didn't turn out for us quite as good as we hoped in 2022, but we have a great chance. I'm sure she's going to be one of those San Francisco liberals and go far to the left. You know, Biden, we thought, might negotiate with us. It turned out he went further to the left than anybody predicted, which is actually true. And we don't want to divide the party and end up with this huge schism and waste this opportunity. And in politics, as in many things in life, you're like this, and nobody wants to like peer over to the other side and see what might be coming next. Now, if Trump decides, listen, I mean, if I run again in 4 years, I'm going to be 83 years old, or 82, going on 83, and even for me, I've had enough. It does open up a competitive Republican primary for 2028 in which the various factions of the party represented by various candidates can duke it out. But Trump will still be ever present in trying to direct things. And I guess the only thing I'm not accounting for, which is always possible, but it didn't happen after 2020. It didn't happen after January 6th. It just didn't happen, is voters could ultimately conclude, Republican voters, you know, he won in 16. He did a lot of good stuff. We really think he got railroaded. We think he got the shaft. We don't think the media was fair. We don't think the courts were fair. But after one victory, 2 losses, and some other losses sprinkled in there, 2022, which they could have done better, we just think it's time to move on. And I suppose that is possible. But I am no longer willing as an analyst to bet that is likely. I do think it's possible that Trump, who's actually, you know, my sources over the years have told me cares about his health and actually thinks a lot about that, could conclude it's just being president into his mid to late 80s. It's not something he wants to do. But I honestly just don't think we can rule it out because it's Trump. So it's hard to say what's going to happen to the party because the leader of the party, I doubt, will retire to private life, even if he didn't run for president. And his presence and his endorsement in primaries still matters so much. And honestly, I don't know that it would matter because Trump's strength is the voters in the Republican Party, even if they're not, it's a plurality. It may not always be a majority, although it proved in this primary season to be a majority, but it's a strong plurality even at its worst. And so when people say, why don't X name your Republican leader in Congress or whatever governor, why don't they stand up to Trump and finally, it's because their voters will throw them out. And so they could do it like Liz Cheney, and it's principled and it makes everybody feel good that care about that. Her voters threw her out, and her father was royalty in that state. Like if you've ever been to the Wyoming State Capitol in Cheyenne, unless they since took it all down now, like his picture's up and Cheney was here, and we're Cheney, and this is great. They didn't care. So this is why I really can't. I gave you options, but I can't say exactly what's going to happen other than I just don't think he'll go away.
You want to add something, Greg?
Yeah, on your point about Trump hovering over everything, even if he doesn't run, it's hard to imagine he'll run. By the way, if he cares so much about his health, maybe eat a little better, man. Come on.
In better shape in the last few years.
The man doesn't drink, and he's 79 years
true.
old, and he runs around giving rallies. Like the energy level is there. He's Trump, but like there's a reason why Biden was worse in these polls of, you know, worried about age and all of that.
Yeah, it's a real thing for sure. Just
The
Yeah, oh my God, the slow
But
turning during
it's,
the debate.
but the perception is.
Yeah, right. So on Trump hovering over everything, I think there's really reason to think that'll happen. In fact, I was joking with a friend the other day that during the 2028 primaries, all the Republican candidates will be on stage, and the debate question will be, do you agree that the election was stolen from Trump in 2020 and in 2024? And every one of them will raise their hands. If Trump loses, that will happen, I swear. But one more thing on this. The reason to think that he could sort of hover over everything well is that if he loses, he's probably going to get convicted of crimes, federal crimes. And that's going to really force a lot of people in the Republican Party to pick a side. And I think there will be heavy pressure to pick Trump's side. And by the way, Vance will have been a very empowered figure at that point. J.D. Vance. I mean, unless Trump throws him under the bus, which I think is, well, right, he will. Right. If Trump loses, it will be J.D. Vance's fault. So I don't know how that affects J.D. Vance's standing in the party. Maybe he has to leave. But I think he's probably going to be, the MAGA faction of the party is really stronger than it has ever been. And I think J.D. Vance will be a formidable figure for 2028, and it'll be very hard to make a case against MAGA at that point, is my view.
If voters, because you talk about maybe the voters would move away from him, like there's this possibility. If he's able to do what he did after 2020, which is convince Republican voters that the election was stolen, why would they go anywhere, right? That's key, right? If the voters are able to be convinced, and you don't have, Republican leadership saying no, this wasn't stolen, or try to do the like cutesy thing that they often do or did right after 2020, was like, yeah, there were some problems, bye, and then run away, right? If they kind of let Trump lead that fight, if he loses and he runs around saying he didn't lose and it was rigged, the voters are going to just go wherever he wants them to, right? If he decides to go, he doesn't have a library yet. If he decides and go to hang out and create a Trump library, and live in Mar-a-Lago and hang out there and just like jump in and out of primary season, there's a possibility he does that. But the possibility that he runs again, I talk to Democrats all the time, like, oh, we'll be through. And I'm like, why do you think that? He will be alive. He will.
Yeah. The only way you're through is if he wins.
Right. Exactly. I will say, like, one of the reasons that he ran in 2020 was because he knew he was going to be criminally convicted or at least charged in a lot of these places. So, with that no longer a possibility because he's already charged, he's been convicted, he hasn't been sentenced, and we have these other things that might happen if Harris were to win. The Justice Department cases will continue. The ones that are in there right now, they won't be shut down by him. There's no reason to think. There's also no reason to think that he wants to jump back in, because a lot of it was because he was like, I'm going to be president again, so I can shut these cases down. So it's like, it's Trump. One day he might wake up and be like, I'm running for president again. Like it's not like how most politicians spend a lot of time thinking about it. That's not how he does. If he wakes up on Tuesday and decides to go and, Trump 2028, then that's what, Republicans are going to have to figure out how to deal with that. I think the frustration with Trump losing over and over, 2018, 2020, not doing well in 2022, 2024, it's going to be a big weight on a lot of Republicans. But what we've seen over the Republican Party since Trump came in was that they're following their voters and not so much leading them, which I think is a really important part of this.
I'll just keep it brief because I think we're out of time. But if Trump loses, there will be a battle for the future and the soul and the definition of the Republican Party. Whether Trump signals that he plans to run yet another time or not, I think that battle will fundamentally come down. There will probably be many iterations of it, but fundamentally, is the party going to be a Trumpist party, or is it going to try to return to something sort of like what it used to be? I don't think there's any going back to the old Republican Party. And some people like Liz Cheney, who represent that, have sort of given up on it. They've said that publicly. At the same time, some of it will be dictated by what happens in the White House and how well Harris is perceived as governing if she wins. The Republicans, the right, will respond to that. And I think some of it will also depend on what happens in the Democratic Party, which of course faces its own factions and disagreements. Do those disagreements and tensions create an opportunity for a more mainstream, less Trumpy party to emerge or reemerge? going forward. But it'll be a fascinating time, whatever happens.
Let me ask one final lightning round question. Over the next 2.5 weeks, is there a race that's kind of below the radar, or a place, even if it's a part of a state as opposed to a whole state, something that you will be watching over the next 2.5 weeks that you think isn't getting enough attention that people should be paying attention to?
I guess I'll just go back to what I said earlier, which is I think the real key to watch is whether Harris really makes gains in this metric of cares about people like you, understands your problems. I would focus on that one number as opposed to the trust on the economy number. If she can really get that number up, really kind of decisively beat Trump on it, or maybe not even decisively, narrowly beat Trump on it, I think that will make a very big difference in neutralizing the economy as an issue. So that's what I'm watching.
The Nebraska Senate race, I think, is more interesting than people might give it credit for. They don't have a Democrat running there. That's an independent who is probably likely, based on how he sounds, even though he says he wouldn't, more likely to side with Democrats in the Senate. And he talks bad about both sides. So I think that aspect of it is interesting, and I think it throws a little wrinkle into how Republicans are feeling about the Senate. I'm going to cheat. Georgia. Post-election lawsuits and elections, I think, is a really interesting place for people to watch, not just because of what happened and what Trump wanted to happen in 2020, but you have this kind of MAGA loyalist election board versus the governor, the secretary of state, and the attorney general, who over here, they're all like, whatever the voters say, well, that's who won, we're moving on. And the election board having a lot more power than they ever have before. And we're already seeing a ton of lawsuits. I wrote about this earlier this week. I think it was this week. A ton of lawsuits about kind of setting the stage for what might happen after the election's over.
You mentioned Nebraska. Nebraska is a fascinating place. I spent 5 years there at the beginning of my career, and people think of it as a red state, as a rural state. It is, except the cities, Omaha and Lincoln, are really quite blue. And a couple of my colleagues have done some reporting on the possibility that Omaha, which splits off its electoral vote, could be the deciding vote for certain scenarios. I think that'd be fascinating if that happens. And I will just mention abortion too. We've seen the salience of that issue the last 2 years since the Dobbs decision. This is, of course, the first presidential election since the Dobbs decision. So I'll be keeping an eye on some of the statewide ballot initiatives, like in Arizona and Florida and elsewhere, and also, what are the down ballot effects in congressional races and so forth.
So there's a lot I could choose from. I hate certainty as a reporter. It scares me. So there are two things I'm watching, which is, Trump is going after, and the Republicans, and that includes in the Senate race here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, that low propensity voter. What if they get them? All right. Also, on the other side, I'm really fascinated at how this ongoing realignment that started because of Trump drawing working class and blue collar voters into the Republican Party. I've been really fascinated by the impact it has had on the Democratic Party, with suburban Republicans and suburban former Republicans and swing voters who are fiscally conservative and care about a robust, robust American global American leadership abroad, have been voting for Democrats. We've talked a lot about how the Republicans are more competitive in the Rust Belt because of this realignment. But, if Harris wins, I'm curious to see if the other side of that realignment had a lot to do with the voters she has gained, and the Democrats have gained now in the third straight election because of that realignment as well. And are we getting to the point where we should stop sort of calling the realignment is sort of over, at least for the time being?
Well, I want to thank our fantastic panel. I could probably do another 2 hours of questions on this stuff because it really is fascinating. And hopefully everyone who was out there, both in person and online, found this as beneficial as I did. So I want to thank all four of you for coming. And as Sigal mentioned, stay tuned for future events that we have in the election series and post-election events to help you understand things and what's going on.
recognize you there.
I was like.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. That was really thank you. Really good to meet you. Thank you so much. Beautiful. Really great conversation.